Hey, Trevor, how you doing?
Well, thank you. How are you?
Good. I've been thinking about this podcast.
Yeah, I must admit I've got a bit worried about it. We've talked a really good game and we've really now got to deliver. This is our first podcast. I don't think it should be our last podcast. So we need to come out the blocks with a really strong presenter. We need someone that's got decades of drug development experience, is a respected scientist. It'd be great if they're a neurologist as well. But I think, and I've got someone in mind, but I'm not sure he's going to do it.
Well, Trevor, that sounds like a real unicorn. If you can find that, that would be awesome.
So the person I have in mind is Gilmore O'Neill, CEO of Editas.
That would be a great start. Do you think he'll do it?
Sorry to interrupt, guys, but I'm willing to do it, provided you tone down the description.
Welcome to Regulatory, the emerging C-suite leader.
This is a podcast where you will be able to hear real-life stories regarding first-in-human challenges, accelerated programs, and understanding what's important from the investor narrative. If you are a biotech CEO, an investor, or a regulatory executive, this podcast is for you.
Well, listen, Trevor and Debra, it's great to meet you. I am an Irish-trained physician, did my internal medicine training in Ireland, and then came to the States where I did my neurology training at Mass General and additional postdoctoral work. I was on staff at Mass General. Frankly, I'm seeing patients until just a little under 10 years ago, but joined industry in 2003. I went to Biogen, and largely because as a board-certified neurologist, I was increasingly frustrated by the lack of choice of therapies that I could bring to patients. And then had very good fortune over the last 20 plus years in that I have led the development, approval, and launch of 6 medicines. And those have covered a wide variety of treatment modalities, including small molecules, biologics, antisense, and I've also worked on other programs using AAV. And now I find myself as CEO of Editas, where we're developing the next generation of in vivo gene editing medicines. I may have those decades of experience and be quite ancient, but I think the key thing is that really what we all have to embrace is the concept of humility when we're actually developing medicines and putting them into patients.
Debra and I would really like to talk to you about how we get from preclinical to proof of concept and some of the FIH challenges that might arise.
So from this perspective, Gilmore, we'd really love to hear, what does success look like in a first-in-human study, and what is regulatory's role in achieving that success in your past experience?
What I would think is absolutely critical very early on in the development of program, and by development, I mean even before you transition from discovery to development, is to start thinking about what is the therapeutic benefit, what is the public health benefit, and ultimately what's the commercial opportunity for the company. But you have to start with the therapeutic and public health benefit and start with a product profile that is clearly going to, differentiate. And then you have to work backwards from there and actually outline the objectives that will have to be achieved throughout your development plan at a clinical, at a CMC, and all the other elements to make sure that you develop a product.
I'm conscious that sometimes you can hear a school of thought that, be careful about talking about risks and stick to real risks. Don't talk about hypothetical risks. It's kind of like withhold that information. Don't talk about risks. Yeah. Whereas is there a view about being more proactive and transparent about what real risks are versus what hypothetical risks are, and having that sort of acknowledgement? I'd be intrigued to understand more about risk sharing and talking about risks when you engage with regulators around a new modality.
Yeah. I sometimes get the perception when I hear people talking about regulatory authorities that they see them almost as somebody to fight with. They see them as an adversary. And I don't see that at all. I see regulators as people who are equally passionate about bringing therapeutics with a positive and appropriately balanced benefit risk to patients. Beyond that is that I strongly believe that a company, a sponsor is, and this might lead to a debate, is the first and last line of defense for the patient. And the reason I say we're the last line of defense is ultimately it is our accountability for how things go with the patient. The regulators play a massively important role in protecting public health. But ultimately, for every person hour that they dedicate to a review, we may have dedicated tens or hundreds of person hours, and we know the program. And this really comes down to a fundamental piece philosophically about engagement with regulators, which I believe, and I think Trevor agrees with as well, which is that everything is based on trust. The regulators do an incredibly deep dive, but ultimately they have to trust that we are doing the right thing, that we are smart enough to be doing it, and that we have enough integrity to do it. And this comes back to the philosophical belief, in my view, about interacting with regulators, which is that when you think about risk, you have to think about it comprehensively and robustly, and then you have to raise it and address it. One of the great things about regulators is they see a lot of information. They process a lot of information. They see a lot of data. They can't say what it is specifically. And a lot of it's never published, so we can't see it. But regulators have that additional ability, not just to be thought partners with us, but to be advisors and say, listen, we can't tell you why this is a bad idea or this is a good idea, but you should think about this.
Absolutely. If I can jump in on that, from my years at FDA, it was not an adversarial relationship. Mm-hmm. We wanted to help. All of the people that I worked with were dedicated to getting medicine safely with a positive benefit to the patient and really working towards that. Real early regulatory engagement helps build that trust. You have to tell the story to them. You know your product better than anybody. You have to educate FDA in a way. And especially if you're like one of the very first ones with a first new modality, there's going to be a huge steep learning curve. And as you mentioned, as FDA gains that experience, then they're going to be able to start providing maybe more concrete advice. And you should be listening.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And, when we talk about risk and so on, particularly when there's a steep learning curve, and the steep learning curve exists for both the regulator as well as the company, because we have to accept that there are substantial numbers of unknown unknowns as well as known unknowns as we actually move medicine in, which means that we have to think very carefully and rigorously about risk. Obviously, the benefit is always there, and we're thinking about that, but sometimes you can get so distracted with benefit that you lose sight of risk. Or when I say you, not you, but one can, a sponsor can. And as we think about risk, in the context of a benefit risk, we have to think about actual risk. Yeah. Because that actual risk has to be accepted. And is it acceptable in the context of a given patient population with a given potential benefit? But then there's also probable and possible risks, which have to be considered. And it's that sort of possible and probable where I think that we need to be really rigorous in thinking and raising those and addressing them, and not sort of pushing them to one side and say, well, it probably isn't going to happen. Yeah. I actually don't believe that is an appropriate approach, because in the end, if something happens, forewarned is forearmed, and you're able, first of all, the first consideration is to look after the patient, make sure that patient, if something happens, that we are ready to help. By the way, sometimes people I've heard people say, well, if we raise this risk, then the agency will, say, oh my God, this is major. I can't give you the specifics of the engagement, but I do remember in a previous life, thinking about a risk and saying, we need to address this, we need to solve this, and then we'll go to the regulator. And then when we went to them, the regulator said, you know what, you could have picked up the phone. In fact, we're a little upset you didn't pick up the phone 6 months ago and discuss this, because we just said, we've thought about that. We don't think it's that big an issue. You're making too big a deal out of this, and you're creating an unnecessary delay. So I would say that, I want to give that as sort of what you might call the counterintuitive experience about discussing risk. Sometimes regulators say, as in this case, you've overthought this. But by the same token, the other possibilities, they might say, okay, yeah, we agree that is a risk, or we had thought of that. But think of the alternative, and this is the way I sort of explain it to people, is, if you think of a possible risk and you don't, first of all, you dismiss it, you haven't thought about it, and a regulator asks you a question about that risk, and you say, actually, we did, oh, well, we thought about, well, we did think of that, but we dismissed it. That doesn't look very good. Or if you did think about it, but you don't raise it with the regulator, say, well, I mean, these are smart people who think about drug development all the time, have seen a lot. They'll say, have you considered this risk? The idea that we're the only ones who will think of a possible risk is naive and arrogant. So the regulator could say, did you think of this? And say, we did think about it, and we had a few thoughts, but we didn't want to raise it with you. And so that immediately says, okay, so what else are they not telling us that they've thought of? The other possibility, of course, is you didn't spend any time thinking about it or really thinking so hard that your brain hurt to say, what are the things that could possibly go on? They ask you the question, say, oh, we didn't think of that. And then they're sitting saying, well, this sponsor really isn't thinking or taking this as serious as they ought. That also undermines trust. So I think there's a significant upside in that it helps build trust. Oh, and there's a final piece, which is that they can help you with that risk. They can, as I said, they say, well, actually, we've thought about that too, or this is something we've considered in previous. We don't think this is an issue. Or we actually have thought about this, or we have seen this. We can't tell you the specifics, but you could consider managing this risk in this way. So I think there's a lot of upside to raising and then addressing, because in fact, many times, in my experience, the regulator can help you address the risk.
Yeah. Clear regulatory strategy early in development helps you mitigate these risks.
So I think actually a clear regulatory strategy is critical to managing risks. I think there's a philosophical piece, which is raise and address. And then there's what is the path we're going to follow to get to ultimate approval? Mm-hmm. And that actually folds into your integrated development plan, which is what are the questions that we need to answer and when do we answer them during the development plan? And those questions, let me be more explicit. When do you determine the population that will be in your label? And how do you get from a first-in-human population to your final label population? They're not necessarily the same. The first-in-human might be a subset of a larger population. I think it's important to think about when you do, because sometimes if you don't think about it, the default is we'll just use the label population that we think we'll want in 5 years, and we'll just bung them into the first-in-human without actually thinking it through. And that can create all sorts of issues, not least of which that when you start in humans, you want to be absolutely certain or want to maximize the probability that if there is a signal related to a medicine, be it an efficacy signal or a safety signal, it's drug related.
Yeah.
So you want to maybe, and so that's an example of how you think about the timing of your objectives or the question you answer. And then you have to go back and say, okay, what is the best country or regulator in which we can actually have those discussions? Because different regulators, frankly, have different strengths.
It was interesting when you talked about risk and how to share it. It felt very much like it's a partnership conversation with regulators where you're on both sides of the table, not opposite one another with regards to how you understand and talk about a risk. There's very much a sort of partnership approach that you're taking that's also predicated on trust as well, which is, I think, an important element with regards to setting the foundation for future conversations that you're likely to have as well. And clearly, knowing you as I do, it's also very much led by science. So there's very much a science base to that conversation.
I think there are two very important elements to this. One is about the science, and the second is about this collaboration. And let's face it, there will be times where a sponsor or I have disagreed with a regulator. But again, I actually think that's de-risking because it means that we know where there's an area of uncertainty. Because obviously, different people and different eyeballs looking at the same data set may actually see different things there. So that's an important piece because ultimately, the sooner you understand where those disconnects or disagreements might lie, the quicker you can actually build a plan to answer or fill that gap. I think going back to what I said about the science, I've had people say to me, the regulator will expect this. And the next question I say is, why would they expect that? They said they want to be conservative and they want X amount of time or blah, blah, blah. I said, hang on a second. Every conversation I've ever had with a regulator, whether it's a non-clinical reviewer, a statistical reviewer, a program manager, whatever, these are scientists. And you don't come in and just say, I think you'll want this for some nebulous reason, so I'm going to offer it. We go in and we say, this is why we think this is the right way to do this. This is why we think this is the right tox study for the right period of follow-up. It's all rational and justified by data. And I have never liked and never have arbitrarily gone in with something because I listened to somebody who said they'll want X, where that person couldn't say, why will they want X? Ultimately, what I would say is part of a regulatory engagement is, what's the why? And may I build on that further, which is many times regulators in a meeting or in a written response prior to a meeting will take a position. And what I've always felt, and we can go on to this more, is that when you're going to have a conversation with them, there are a couple of things that are going to happen. First of all, you're building a relationship, and it's a long-term relationship. Winning the conversation, there's no win. Ultimately, we're all trying to get a product, not only a product to market, but a product that stays on the market that gives patients a positive benefit risk. So you're not winning any conversation. It's about building a relationship. I think the second thing is not to make somebody change their mind in the conversation, is to understand why are they taking a position that might not agree with you? What more do they need to hear? Or very importantly, and I think this is real value, remember I said that regulators know things that we don't know and that will never be published. Obviously, within the bounds of what's appropriate, to understand, is there something they have seen, even if they can't tell you what it is, where they can say, listen, I can't tell you, but this is an area you need to worry about. The data aren't out there, but I can give you a few ideas. So when somebody says, a regulator writes in a sense, a terse sentence, we disagree for XYZ, but you don't understand it. Go in and don't say, you're wrong because. Go in and say, help me understand why it is that what is your key concern under this? Again, I put a lot in there, but again, this goes back to, it's about a relationship, a long-term relationship which is going to extend beyond the approval of the medicine. And it's actually also about understanding our journey together in actually sorting out what are the problems and questions we need to answer, and when do we best answer them, and how do we best answer them.
I think the approach that you're referring to speaks very much to that partnership with regards to, as a sponsor, you may not know all of the answers, and that actually the conversation you're having is important because there may be other factors that you need to understand and also bring into your own conversation. So it's almost you're learning together with regards to how to move a program forward and what are the important attributes that you need to look at. I imagine you may have some experiences where perhaps things haven't quite worked like that, where you've seen teams that perhaps haven't approached in that spirit of partnership and really trying to work together to find the most optimum way forward in designing an FIH or a proof of concept study.
One of the things I've learned about teams over the years, and I think, Trevor, you and I might have the same experience, and I think I might have learned it from you, or a large part of it is, I've always felt, particularly when you get written feedback prior to a face-to-face meeting, that the team should review it in detail. Now, sometimes people say, we want to ask them about responses 1, 3, and 7. And I say, before we do that, let's go through each one of their written responses. And I want to go around the table to each member of the team, and obviously it's a multidisciplinary but focused team, say, what do you think that response means? If everybody agrees that they understand the meaning of that response, great. If one person thinks it means one thing and 5 people think it means the other, there's a reason to elevate that and say, okay, we need to understand what that means, because clearly 2 different people reading this response are interpreting it differently. That means there's uncertainty worthy of exploration. And so an example for a first in human, in a pre-IND setting where you're more likely, or it could even be in a clinical hold, is they say, here's a problem. We need to decide what are the things that you want to spend time on discussing and clarifying with them. Was it an issue? Is it an issue with the starting dose? Is it an issue with the staggering or the sentinel time? And very importantly, why? Why is that the issue? Because you may have the data, or you may be generating the data, and it's ready much sooner to address that issue than you might think.
I think that is a really good point. I would take it a step further in terms of preparing. And it goes back to how you were saying about understanding the risks and mitigating the risks. That as you're preparing, as you're waiting around for FDA's response back, as you really consider the questions, okay, really think of it from the regulatory path, the viewpoint again, and really pressure test it and be prepared to what do you think they're going to say about this? Because sometimes you go in there and you're proposing something that is a little controversial or is pushing the envelope better. Really have that reasoning and architecture laid out to be able to address it when, by chance you get a face-to-face meeting.
Yes, and it's important that ability to have that conversation is so important, but being ready for it. You have to think about all the possibilities, not just because of what you would call the expected interactions of the agencies, but you have to accept sometimes, unfortunately, and I've had this experience in my career, that something happens where you have an unscheduled interaction with the agency. If there's a serious adverse event or a SUSAR, sometimes that elevates to the level of a conversation because there's a discussion about, is there a clinical hold? It's not just the US, but there are obviously different ways of trials being suspended. And sometimes you want to do it. And the agency might actually say, hang on, before you do that, let's have a conversation, or vice versa. You might think we keep going, that the protocol is met, but the agency says, well, we need to have a discussion. And the reason I say this is important is because when you, for example, have agreement on a path forward, that doesn't mean that you stop thinking, okay? Because you have to continuously be learning. And you may learn things that may occur in another program and say, well, hang on a second, we hadn't thought of that. This may be relevant here. And don't fall into the trap of saying, well, we've agreement on this, so everything's copacetic, we'll keep going. You say, well, hang on a second. This may mean that something could happen. We, at the very minimum, need to consider that and be ready, because, I'll give you an example. I've had experiences where I've had a clinical hold, which took a very long time to raise. And I've had a clinical hold where we turned it around really quickly, or we had adverse, feedback from an agency, which we turned it very quickly because between the first interaction and that adverse response, or change of position, we did additional work. We said, you know what, there are additional risks that haven't been considered, or benefit risks that we have considered. And we did a deep dive. So when the agency raised it and said, well, actually, there's an issue here, we said, actually, here is the additional, we started thinking about that too, and we've done this analysis. Mm-hmm. Here is an analysis that is relevant to helping interpret what we're seeing here. The thinking and the preparation and the anticipatory piece, both for the management of the study, of management of risk and benefit, and helping work with the agencies or regulators around the world, never stops.
Yeah. So can I just double click a bit more on benefit risk, Gilmore? Yeah. I'm conscious as a small biotech, sometimes there's a great deal of pressure that you want to get into FIH as quickly as possible. You want to generate data so that you can show others and investors that, look, we can see that our asset is working. But how important is it stepping back to look at what's the benefit risk? What is it that matters to patients? And ultimately, the target label profile. And you touched upon this, about thinking about the end in mind as you then go back to the FIH. And are there people that you look to be the architects of helping you design and correlate with regards to what an FIH would look like, so that you can have those more meaningful conversations such that when you hopefully get positive data, you're able to translate what that means?
Yes. So, first of all, there are two pressures. There should always be two pressures. And the first leading pressure should be making sure that the subjects that agree to be the first humans in whom you dose are safe and protected. And, safety, again, is a relative. Water at the right dose or the wrong dose is a dangerous substance, but it's also life-saving. So that's a wonderful example of benefit risk. But, there's nothing without risk, but you have to make sure that first and all, the primacy position, or the prime position, is the welfare of the patients or human subjects, healthy subjects, that go into your first in human. And then the second pressure is to advance a medicine rapidly at the right rate, but rapidly, because ultimately, if you have a medicine where the benefit risk is really robust, the longer you take to get there, there are patients waiting for that medicine. So you've got to get that tension right. What I'm trying to say is not a if and then. You have to be doing that in parallel. You have to drive, but always understanding that you have to make sure that the human subjects are safe and managed. So I think that's how you manage that tension. I think may actually say, in fact, for a small sponsor, and I hope this comes across the right way, the way I say it, you actually need to be even more careful or more rigorous in thinking forward, because you do not have the luxury of time if there's a stumble. A large sponsor with multiple programs and large revenues can actually, do things a little more slowly. A small company, has to really think through things very rigorously, because it can't afford, or it's less able to absorb mistakes or delays that may arise after dosing where something arises. In other words, what you want to do is have very little things happening in an unexpected manner. You need to be ready.
When I think about risk, I think most people tend to think about risk and they think of it in terms of clinical risk, like harm to the patient. But there's more that goes into that risk assessment in terms of the non-clinical data to support it, the CMC, where are you in manufacturing, and those kind of things all influence safety and risk as well. How have you seen that play out in programs you've been working with in terms of being prepared or ill-prepared in those two different areas?
Fortunately, I've rarely seen people being ill-prepared, largely, because I think we had the right people at the table. But you're absolutely right. Risk is not just about patient harm. I mean, obviously, that's sort of the ultimate risk. It's about all the other elements that have an impact, be it on time, cost, quality, which you should never negotiate on, but time and cost are important at a CMC level, etc. I think some of the things one has to think, and this goes back to starting at the end and working your way back to first in human. Some of the things you have to think about are that you can actually you can manufacture drug product or drug substance at an appropriate level of quality that is safe for the patients that are going to be exposed to it. But a critical challenge is ensuring that you can do that, make that product at scale, repeatedly, with appropriate quality as you go into more and more patients and ultimately into the commercial space. And so some things you can do is you can actually manage to do that at appropriate quality for patients at a small scale that's required for phase 1. But you need to look forward beyond that phase 1 and start thinking about it now, early, which is when we start scaling up, how do we ensure that we can back reference what we're making in this after the scaling process to what we do in first in human? So the reason that's important is because sometimes you need to think about, is there a bridging component that you have to build in? And I've had that experience in previous lives, both with biologics, less so with small molecules, but certainly with biologics. And I think that's an important consideration as you go into first in human. That's a classic example of, it goes back to something I think Trevor touched on about, the sponsor and trying to get into first in human. Yes, you want to get first in human, but you have to be sure that you actually have mapped a path to not just safety, but dose selection, and then obviously your pivotal and your pivotal experiments or trials and your label. But there are many other elements that actually are going to overlap or be integrated into that on top of the clinical. And you need to think about that well in advance, because ramping investment has to be timed appropriately, where you've de-risked the investment, but you actually invested a sufficient time to minimize delay or back-ended risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where having that regulatory voice at the table early in development to align with understanding when these pivot points are coming, where the regulatory risk comes in, what are the regulatory standards at each phase of development, and again, tying it back to that target product profile as the end game.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital. I think a couple of things that, again, I've learned over the years, which is there's the target product profile, which is the totality, But I think one should be thinking about product characteristics, at sort of a CMC level very early on, and continuously referencing them back to the product profile. I think the other element is, and I'm just going to raise it because I've seen it in companies, large companies or smaller companies. Sometimes, people sort of split out regulatory. Sometimes you sort of have CMC regulatory and then regulatory. And I think and sometimes they even sit in different parts of the company or even different parts of the planet. And it's critical to make sure that interaction is occurring not just within the regulatory organization, but in combination with the different expertise or subject matter experts in the room or on the call. And that's a vital interaction. And it sometimes people feel, well, it's tedious, we've got to bring all these people together, etc. It is absolutely critical because you have to line up your product characteristics and your product profile. And if you're continually evaluating how they line and match up, and then you have to be thinking about the timeline and the investment as you actually ensure that you're making sure that these stay, united and are converging on the right, ultimate profile.
That makes perfect sense to me, and it aligns with my thinking too, that going back to the point that you made earlier about telling the right story and getting all the people in the room together so that you're aligned internally on that story and where you intend to go, so that when you speak and interact with the regulators, you know where you're going and you've got your narrative out there that pulls together all the elements necessary.
So there's one thing I want to return to, something that Trevor said at the very beginning of this podcast, which is he said, Gilmore, do you agree that regulatory strategy should be leading the strategy? And what I'm going to say is I partly agree with you, Trevor, which is I think regulatory strategy is absolutely vital, a vital component and a critical component which needs to be framed really early on. And I don't mean in development, I mean even before you move into preclinical development. When you're about to go, you're doing your DC or your drug candidate selection, you need to be thinking about it already. Because frankly, if you haven't thought about it, you could start making a significant investment and say, oh, there's no path. The point I'm trying to make is that I don't like to say one particular function owns something or not. I mean, yes, there has to be accountability, and that goes into how decision-making is made. But ultimately, I'm not aware of any drug that was built by one person or one particular skill set. It's this integrated set of skills that need to be brought together. And, the regulatory strategy is absolutely critical, and it ultimately ties together clinical, CMC, and other elements that all converge on what is ultimately going to be a product that's going to go into patients. But that also has to be usable. It has to be transformative. Otherwise, why develop it? And I'm very strong views about that. I don't like making iterative improvements. And maybe I've been lucky to have that sort of opportunity to participate in drugs that really have been transformational. But it also has to be done in a way that you can get reimbursement. And I know that, and this probably goes into something that we could discuss more, which is that in many ways, the reimbursement world and the regulatory world have been converging. And I know there's been we've always tried to make sure we kind of make sure that you don't create a perception that sort of commercial marketing gets tied into and compromises the regulatory or vice versa. But the reality is that developing a drug, getting it approved and launching it is pointless if people don't get to use it. And to get to use it, the reimbursement piece has to be important. Now, the interesting thing, obviously, is that over my career time, I think when I started, regulatory and reimbursement were actively separated across all jurisdictions, all regulatory jurisdictions. Now we've seen certain elements, both at a national level or even at a transnational level like the EMA, where the reimbursement piece is coming together. There might be a firewall between sort of HTA and assessments and central advice, for example, at EMA, but where they've actually created fora or forums where those discussions can happen together. So, and again, I just wanted to come back to what Trevor said about sort of the fact that, it's all about bringing a lot together, and a lot of different skill sets, but it's also understanding that the environment is changing, and where regulatory sits and its insights has probably expanded over the last 20 plus years.
A closing question for you. If you think about wearing your CEO hat and you think about drive to FIH, what are your expectations of your regulatory leader? Now, I say that recognizing and acknowledging your point. It's a team sport. This is about everyone coming together, but equally, everyone also has their own accountabilities. What do you look for in a regulatory leader to bring to the table as you're driving towards an FIH or a proof of concept?
What I look to in a regulatory leader, a few things. The first is how to solve the problem. I don't want to be told all the obstacles. I want to be told, how do we actually deal with this? How do we interpret the guidance where it exists? How do we determine where the issues are where guidance doesn't exist? Because there's both opportunity and there are also risks where guidance doesn't exist. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is a regulatory leader who actually challenges the questions and the arguments, and most particularly the arguments and the rationale. I'm going to tell you what I don't want. I don't want a regulator to say, the agency will expect this because they always have, or the agency will expect this because it's a conservative division or agency. I want a regulator to say more proactively, why do you think this is an appropriate duration of a study? Or why do you think this is the appropriate study design, be it outcomes, duration, number of animals? Just say it's preclinical for Hurst and human. A regulatory leader outlines the needs from a strategic point of view, but then actually at an operational or quality level, challenges every argument and actually plays out. By the way, Deborah, I'm channeling my experiences with Trevor and a few of his colleagues in the past who were very and essentially red teamed us and basically said, why? And they give our argument and say, well, you know, your first part, your second part are good, your third part is weak. There's a gap there. Is that because you don't know it, or is it because there's something else we need to do? And I think the third piece for I would want from a regulatory leader is to drive those first two things earlier than anyone actually thinks is necessary.
I think the important part as well that's coming across very clearly, Gilmore, is even as a CEO, you want to be challenged. It's almost that concept of truth to power. It's like, I want to be challenged. We're all equal in this scientific conversation.
I think the simplest thing is, and maybe this is too philosophical, the truth is the truth. And you can ignore it or you can go looking for it, but it will find you. And that would be okay if the consequences are minor. But in this case, the consequences of the truth, where the truth is a bad outcome in a patient, it's bad for the patient. It should be bad for all of us from a conscience point of view. And frankly, it can be catastrophic for a therapeutic that handled correctly could have actually created huge benefit for patients. So that's really where I'm at, which is you got to find the truth. The truth is there, and you got to go looking for it because it will find you if you don't find it first.
So I'm very conscious of your time, Gilmore. Thank you very much for the conversations that we've had. That was a truly great conversation with Gilmore. One of those guiding principles is often there's a rush to get to the FIH and generate data when really the CEO and others are looking to the regulatory leader to stand back and help the team understand what is the purpose of the FIH? How does it fit with the end in mind? How does it fit with the label?
When you are able to bring preclinical and CMC and clinical teams aligned early around a clear regulatory story, it really helps prevent surprises and reduces risks. Regulatory is the voice that not just sets the guardrails or describes what might need to be done, but also challenges the team.
I think that was also quite empowering by Gilmore, who very clearly said, even though I'm the CEO, I want to be challenged, and to challenge in the source of getting to the truth.
Okay, so I think the next episode is going to be really challenging to try and follow this one. It was so great.
So we need to make sure that we get a really good person that we can talk to.
What do you think we should do, Trevor?
I think a CEO would be great because they're under such pressure in being in front of investors, analysts, creating a credible story. They may pull upon other team members to help them, and maybe we can explore that. But ultimately, it's getting that CEO vision of what matters, I think will be really good.
So stay tuned to find out who.